So we wanted to go find someone who has to deal with this kind of thing, and Ken Jenkins is an aviation crisis expert, and he joins us here on the Gary Sutton Show. Ken, great to have you in this morning. Not so great the circumstances, obviously. You've written a book, by the way, called Stories of Courage and Survival in Aviation Disasters. So this is not the first time you've come across something like this, is it?
Well, it's the first time from a pilot suicide potential, but it is not the first accident I've worked. I've worked a total of 12 in my career, Gary.
Well, you know, Ken, when you look at these, now are you a pilot yourself?
I am not.
Okay, but you're a guy that's called in on these kinds of situations. What specifically do you do in those kind of situations in the 12 that you've dealt with?
Well, in the situations that I work with and I have worked in, it's on the humanitarian side of working with the families in the aftermath of an accident. And that butts right up against the accident investigation, because the number one thing that families want, and I think rightly so, in human nature, is what happened. What happened to my loved one? How did it happen? And why did it happen? And I think that's playing right into how the BEA is investigating this accident and providing this news so quickly. Is once they listened to the cockpit voice recorder that you talked about in the introduction, they had a very clear picture of what they believed happened. And I don't know that there's any additional information they have that they haven't shared with us,
right,
but they were confident enough with that information to brief the families this morning before they briefed the media, which is a nice thing to see, because families should be shared this information first. So, you know, while there are a few people, as I've watched the reports this morning, that say there's a little wiggle room there where there could have been a health issue that might have prevented the pilot from opening the door.
Right.
The French government doesn't think that's the case.
Well, and especially I was listening this morning to some of the guys talking about the technical side of doing this, and for him to have locked the door so the other pilot couldn't come in, which we now know, we've heard that from the recorder in there, for him to have locked the door, that's kind of a very deliberate kind of thing that you have to do, right?
It is. It's a deliberate action. And then he said the descent course. And I know that you had mentioned, you know, it was a controlled descent, but why would you do that if your intention is to fly the plane, you know, into the mountain? And I contacted a colleague of mine who ironically had lost a family member in an accident, an aviation disaster 20 years ago, and she's now a clinical social worker and deals with grief and this kind of work as well. And I asked her about that, and she said, you know, it's not unusual because somebody may decide at the last minute they're not going to go through with it. So a controlled descent would simply mean, this is my intention, but I still have the opportunity to pull back if I decide I don't want to go through with it.
Wow, that's really interesting. You know, I don't know if any of us can think to the degree of saying, you know, maybe suicide's involved here. And again, we don't know that for sure, and yet by the guy's silence, you know, that's very troubling, and you know, a little heavier that all of a sudden he's trying to kick the door down and he can't get it kicked out, knowing full well what's happening. And you know, you sit back and you say, what leads someone to even think in that direction if that in fact turns out to be the case?
Well, and you know, certainly that's the big question on the investigator's mind, and I'm sure the family member's mind as well. And I would almost guarantee you, Gary, that we're going to start to see now, because of this event, what are the psychological evaluations that pilots go through. As part of this investigation, they're going to be looking, I would assume, at any stressors he may have experienced before the flight, and measuring his breathing and seeing, you know, because he made a point of saying it was very steady all the way through, which to some degree is alarming to me, that he knows he's going to fly the plane into the ground and his breathing's not even becoming more rapid.
Well, they also said he had a very cool conversation, you know, going up to the 38,000 with the other pilot, that there was nothing noticeable in the way the conversation was going on.
Exactly. So, you know, what are those indicators, you know, that maybe people may have missed? Is there a family history? All of those things are going to have to be examined, I think, as the investigation goes forward.
I've been trying to watch a little bit of some of the press conferences this morning, and one of the things, they said the pilot did nothing improper in, you know, leaving the program. He was actually in, I guess, the pilot training program. He left for a period of time, and I have yet to figure out what that is. Maybe somebody can help me with that. But he left apparently for a period of time, then came back and completed the program. They're saying the CEO of Lufthansa say, well, there's nothing improper about that, and there's probably not. But when you leave, we talk about terrorists, and when they leave our country and they go over somewhere and they end up coming back, you look at the Sarnaev brothers, for example, and they come back and they have turned into terrorists, we start to wonder, okay, if you left, why did you leave? What was it that took you away? Why are you coming back now? Those got to all be questions right now that are on the table, right?
No, I would assume so. I mean, hindsight 2020 is you have the accident and you take the point of impact and then you work backwards.
Right.
So part of that certainly I would imagine is going to be part of that investigation as well, is why did he leave, how long was he gone, as you said, where did he go, and did that departure have anything to do with what happened in this particular flight?
You talked about your kind of investigation where you're working from the humanitarian side, butting up against the physical investigation where they're gathering the bodies, they're gathering the pieces of the plane, they're trying to figure out what happened. And I imagine you cross paths many times. Tell us how you deal with that. I mean, that's got to be the most difficult thing in the world, to deal with people and have to somehow say, here's what happened. How do you do that?
It is very challenging, and I wish I had a good answer for you for how I do it. But I can say from a process standpoint for investigators and responders and the humanitarian teams from the airlines, like Germanwings and Lufthansa have their volunteer teams that are coming in to work with families, is all of that psychological help that is provided to families if they choose to utilize that. Similar things are offered to the employees and the responders as well. So during the course of the deployment, if you will, they have the opportunity to go to critical incident stress debriefs or diffusings, and have that opportunity to talk about what they're seeing on scene or challenges in the response and whatnot, and kind of talk it out. I mean, that's really what it's about, is to be able to get it off your chest so that you can continue to do the work.
I was listening this morning again to some people who were professional pilots. And one of the things that they said, Ken, we're talking with Ken Jenkins this morning, who is a guy who works in these kind of crisis situations, and aviation's crisis consultant, also has written a book on it, Resilience, Stories of Courage and Survival in Aviation Disasters. And they were saying that in the United States, you have to always have two people in the cockpit. It doesn't matter if the guy goes out for a break, they have to bring in a flight attendant or whatever, but not so for Lufthansa and maybe a lot of the European countries. Have you heard any of that at all? And talk a little bit about that if you can.
Well, I can't confirm what Germanwings or Lufthansa does, but there certainly are variances in procedures throughout the world. And a recent example I can share with you is I was flying out of Heathrow Airport in London to another location. I don't want to mention the airline. And because, I'm an aviation person, and the pilot was the flight attendant came and got me and said the pilot would like to see you. And so I went into the cockpit, and I thought it was going to be a brief discussion. And they're like, oh, have a seat, strap in, and you can stay here for landing. You wouldn't see that in the United States today unless you're another pilot or you're an FAA check writer, or, an FAA representative or somebody designated to be there. But apparently in other parts of the world, you can do that, or they did it and didn't think anything about it.
They have this one flight recorder, and apparently the other information they found the shell casing for it, but they haven't found the other recorder. Is that essential to be able to put this together, or as you said earlier, you're working for the crash backward right now? Could they start to put the pieces together on this guy as they go backward?
Well, they can certainly start on a psychological profile, if you will, and I'm sure they'll do that for the co-pilot, and they'll do that for the pilot as well. I mean, you certainly want to cross your T's and dot your I's, but the flight deck recorder is important because it will measure all inputs that were made from the cockpit, and then you can marry those inputs up to the conversation, down to the second of what's going on verbally in the cockpit, so you can hear and then see what's being being done, when that descent began, when the input was made into the computer, when it actually began, and any other inputs the pilot may have made. So it certainly is a critical piece of information to have to get a complete picture.
One of the things that was said this morning, just before 10 o'clock in this press conference, was, as a general practice, pilots in the Lufthansa group do not undergo psychological testing. I have a feeling that you're going to have a call for that after this, if it turns out what happened really happened here in terms of this suicide mission this guy was apparently flying.
Well, and you know, as we mentioned earlier, Gary, I think you're certainly going to see, and I think you just said it, it's going to at least be discussed. And whether it will bring any changes, I know that the way the merits of, you know, the psychological evaluation versus when somebody has a, you know, a potential break, would an evaluation catch that or not? How deep do you evaluate an individual before you make a determination that they're fit to fly? So those are all kinds of things that I think will be at least discussed, if nothing else, and then may lead to changes in hiring practices going and certifications going forward.
This co-pilot was a 28-year-old German national. His name is Andreas Lubitz, and he had interrupted his training for several months and then completed it. They said that's not unusual. And then they said he passed all flight examinations and medical examinations with 100% fit to fly. This is according to the CEO of German National Airlines. But, you know, something else that occurred to me, Ken, I wanted to kind of pop this off you if I could, and we may have to answer when we come back from the break, but I'll pose you the question now. We saw after 9/11 all kinds of changes made to the doors, to the cockpit, and all those kind of things where people could not storm the cockpit anymore on planes such as we saw on 9/11. Again, are we going to see all kinds of questions now and saying, well, you know, here you had a guy coming back who was pushing in the code of the doors, and this guy somehow overrode the code from inside. So it seems like you have maybe a catch-22 situation. I want to see if we can address that when we come back and talk a little bit about where is the happy medium there. You want to keep bad people out. We heard about the guy the other week who rushed the cabin door, and a whole bunch of people jumped him before he got there. But, you know, we want to keep those people out, and yet we don't want to keep the pilot out. So what do? We're going to ask Ken Jenkins that question when we come back. And, of course, Ken is an aviation crisis consultant and has written a book called Resilient, Stories of Courage and Survival in Aviation Disasters. He'll be back with us here on The Gary Sutton Show. Where is the happy medium? So here we are. We say we're going to make the cockpit safe. The pilots can't be attacked. The plane can't be taken over that way. And yet here we have a situation where the guy that actually had the code to get in there couldn't get in because this guy overrode that code. I mean, is there something wrong here, Ken? Again, are we going to have something that's going to be discussed again coming out of this situation?
Well, it's certainly going to be discussed, Gary, and I wouldn't be surprised that we see process and system changes to that door, right, and how it's locked. With any aviation accident, the one thing that there are many things you glean from them, but you want to learn how to prevent it from happening again. And it's unfortunate that sometimes it takes an accident to lead to really good safety improvements with a particular aircraft type or the aircraft, any aircraft. That's going to happen here too. It will be examined. What are ways to overcome that from happening again, and that may lead to modifications to the door in the future.
You know, people say, well, why do you spend so much time in this last few days on news organizations and so forth? Because, you know, and one of the things that hit me, Ken, I wanted to get your remark on this. We are all in that plane. There isn't anything, I think, any worse than thinking about being in a plane crash and going down from, 38, 40,000 feet, as we saw in this one. I think we all kind of put ourselves in there, in a certain way, don't we? And the thought, I'm looking here for the audio recording, they're saying the last few minutes, screaming could be heard, and then death was instantaneous for those on board when the plane crashed. I mean, it's about as horrific as anything we can imagine, I think.
Well, it is, and I hadn't thought about this until just this very moment. But we saw changes, as you mentioned, after 9/11 with the cockpit door. We also saw our human nature change in this respect, that passengers, along with the flight attendants on board, no longer take things for granted. I mean, somebody's unruly on a plane and they deal with it right away. There's no hesitation to interrupt an aircraft to drop off an unruly passenger or for passengers to get out of their seats and help the flight crew subdue them.
Yep.
And
you just saw that, about 2 weeks ago, the guy that rushed the door on a plane and the passengers jumped him?
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
So it's an aggressive, you're pretty antsy when you're on a plane now and you see anybody doing anything that's kind of, off balance. I remember hearing the two guys interviewed who jumped this guy, and they kept his arms away from his body in case he had stuff strapped to his chest. They kind of were pretty alert as to what all might be going on there.
Well, and while I think that's a good thing to a large degree, it's like, how do we handle an event like this as human beings on the plane, as passengers, when the pilot intentionally does something? And that's a whole other explanation, and something we're going to, I'm sure we'll find a way to incorporate that into our lives, but it's an unfortunate experience. It's just a very scary, scary thought.
Brian, my producer, was sitting there, and he said something about it. He says, where was, like, the air marshal? And one of the things that we generally think is there are air marshals in every plane. There really aren't, are there?
No, they're not. They're not on every plane, and I'm not sure how they work, how the system works within or intra-Europe or intra-Asia. I know through the Federal Air Marshal Program that from the U.S. and even from the United States to international locations, they may be on flights, but within country boundaries, I would assume, and again, sometimes assumptions are a bad thing to make, that there's a similar type program, but don't know that to be the case. And even if it was, there's no guarantee there'd be one on that flight.
Right, and again, maybe the call comes out after this too. And again, there's an awful lot of question marks out there, so I couch what I'm going to say with those question marks. But maybe there's a call then to put a marshal inside the cockpit on every flight.
Sure, and that goes back to what we were just talking about a few seconds ago, is hindsight, again, is a wonderful thing.
Absolutely.
Step back and say, now how do we amend our processes or procedures to reduce the risk of this happening again? And that might very well be one of them.
And it seems like every time we do something to make it safer, someone finds another way to kind of get around it.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's kind of a sad thing. So what now we see families being flown to near the site. This is a very inaccessible site. You can't even put a helicopter down there, from what I understand.
Right.
This is where you step in. What do you do with the families at that point? They want to be nearby where their loved ones spent their last moment, I guess. And
sure.
What are the typical things that you have to do at that moment?
Well, the things that are going on, and let's go to the site location, is there's, and they may call it something different where they are today, but in the United States, and it would be a similar type process, is a family assistance center will be established. And it is a center where the airline employees and other stakeholders, say a medical examiner / coroner type of individual, along with the airline CEO, the investigators, on a routine basis, whether it's in the morning or it's in the afternoon or in some cases both, will stand in front of the families in this family assistance center and provide them with a structured briefing of, here's what we found during the investigative process today, here's what's going to happen tomorrow, what questions do you have about what we shared, so they can ask questions about what's going on in the investigation. There will be an update usually from the disaster mortuary person, which is the medical examiner equivalent, about how long they think it'll take to identify all passengers and crew on board. The airline employees that are volunteers that are working with the families are taking care of hotel accommodations and flying family members in to help support them.
Right.
There's access to mental health care and child care and spiritual care. It's almost like a little city is created so that a lot of the logistical things that families don't have the time to deal with right now because they're trying to process everything they're being shared with, they're taking the employees or the volunteers in this family assistance center are taking those things away from them so that they can focus their time where they want to.
And now, of course, you're moving away from the focus on the plane somehow being faulty to now the human component in it, which really maybe adds a little bit more pain to all this, I would think.
Well, exactly. And, I'd mentioned earlier that I talked to my colleague that is a clinical social worker,
right.
I say colleague, and she's a dear friend of mine, and who lost her brother in an accident. And I said, from a family member perspective, what does this do for the families? And I said, they've got to be angry. And she said, certainly they're going to be emotional, and they may be in shock. But you have to look at it from this perspective. They have an answer.
Yeah.
They know what happened.
Yeah.
She said, ask the families of Malaysia Flight 370 if they have that answer
Well, that's
yet.
a great point. Really a great
And,
point.
and I hadn't thought about it until she said that to me, and I said, that is exactly that. It's an excellent point. At least the families have an answer. And one of the things that I've shared with airline employees and whatnot in my business is people can handle the truth if you tell them. And there's sometimes that human nature aspect of us that says, I don't want to share something that is so traumatic or could be so harmful because it will bring additional grief on top of the accident. But withholding that information is what provides the grief, because it'll always come out. The information always comes out. So when you have it, provide it. And I applaud the BEA for doing that in this case.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, difficult times there, Ken. Thanks so much for taking time this morning to take us inside and give us some insights into what is going on right now. And again, lots of questions that need to be answered yet. We've talked before. It's a pleasure talking to you again, Ken, and I hope we can talk on a little happier moods next time.
That would be nice, Gary. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Ken. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Ken Jenkins, who is an aviation crisis expert. You can also check out his book if you'd like to, Resilience: Stories of Courage and Survival in Aviation Disasters.